Society forgives a great many sins. It forgives cruelty dressed in silk, and greed dressed in good breeding. What it does not forgive is a woman who refuses to disappear when she is told to. This is the story of a torn hem, a stolen coat, and a duke who decided, in front of the entire county, exactly whose side he was on. If you have ever been laughed at for wearing what little you had, listen closely. The ballroom at Ashworth House smelled of beeswax candles, crushed lilies, and the particular perfume of old money trying very hard to look effortless. Chandeliers dripped light across a floor so polished it looked like black water. 200 of the finest families in the county had been poured into silk and lace and set loose to circle one another like well-dressed sharks. Eleanor Marsh stood against the far wall, half hidden behind a marble column, exactly where she was supposed to stand. She was 23, though the permanent, careful stillness in her posture made her look older. Her gown was a soft grey-blue muslin, 3 seasons out of fashion, let out at the seams twice to fit a figure that had grown thinner, not fuller, in the years since her father's death. It had been her mother's gown once. She had unpicked the old lace trim herself, by candlelight, so no one would recognize it. "You are slouching," said a voice at her elbow. Aunt Priscilla did not look at her when she spoke. She never did. Her aunt's eyes were fixed across the room, on the glittering shape of her own daughter. "Stand up straight. Eleanor, you reflect on this family, whether you wish to or not." "Yes, Aunt." "And do not, under any circumstance, dance. We are not paying for a companion to be admired. We are paying for a companion to fetch lemonade and hold reticules." Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be repeated back to her later. Sharper and colder, in the privacy of her small room under the eaves. She had learned that lesson at 17, the year her father's debts had swallowed the last of her inheritance and delivered her, like a parcel nobody wanted, to her uncle's house. 5 years of learning exactly how much space a person could be trained to take up. The answer, she had discovered, was very little. Across the room, Seraphina Vane was radiant, and she knew it. She wore ice-blue silk that had cost more than the Marsh family's entire yearly income, and she wore it the way a queen wears a crown, as though the alternative had never occurred to her. She was 21, golden-haired, and possessed of the particular beauty that made rooms go quiet when she entered them. Tonight, she was practically vibrating with triumph, because tonight, the Duke of Wrenmoor was expected to make their engagement official in front of witnesses who mattered. "He is late," Seraphina said to no one in particular, snapping her fan shut. "He arrived an hour ago," her mother corrected quietly. "He is speaking with your father. Then he should be speaking with me." Elena watched from her post by the column. She had met the Duke exactly once, briefly, 3 weeks earlier, when he had called at the house to discuss settlements with Lord Vane. He had not looked at her at all that day. Why would he? But she remembered the impression he had left, regardless. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that came from either great discipline or great exhaustion. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow. He had walked with a very slight, very controlled limp that he seemed determined no one would notice. He crossed the ballroom now, and the crowd parted, the way crowds part for wealth and rank, which is to say, instantly and with great enthusiasm. Gideon Ashworth, Duke of Wrenmoor, did not smile as he walked. He looked, Elena thought, Like a man crossing a battlefield he had already lost interest in. "Your Grace." Seraphina's curtsy was a masterpiece of engineered grace, dropping just low enough to show respect, just shallow enough to show confidence. "We had begun to despair of you. Lord Vane required my signature on several documents." Gideon's voice was low, flat, entirely without warmth. "It is done." "Wonderful." Seraphina's smile did not waver. Though something flickered behind her eyes, the particular frustration of a woman accustomed to men falling over themselves for her attention, faced instead with polite indifference. "Will you dance with me?" "Your Grace, everyone is watching. I am aware." He did not sound pleased about it. He offered his arm regardless, because refusing would have created exactly the kind of scene his mother had spent a lifetime training out of him. And Seraphina took it, and they moved onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and 200 people pretended not to watch a transaction disguised as a romance. Elena watched too, because it was easier than looking at anything else, and because there was something almost hypnotic about the practiced perfection of it, until, halfway through the second turn, the Duke's gaze lifted from his partner's shoulder and drifted, briefly, unmistakably, across the room, and landed on her. It was nothing, a fraction of a second. His expression did not change, but Elena felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, and she looked down at the floor immediately, her face heating, furious with herself for the reaction. She did not see him look away. The dance ended. Seraphina, flushed with the attention of the room, decided she required air, and lemonade, and her companion, in that specific order. And so Elena found herself weaving through the crowd toward the refreshment table, glass in hand, when Seraphina's cousin Marguerite caught her by the wrist. "Is that Charlotte Marsh's old gown?" Marguerite asked, not bothering to lower her voice. Two other young ladies turned to look. "I thought I recognized that lace pattern. How resourceful of you." "Marguerite," one of the others murmured, half laughing, half scandalized. The particular tone of girls who enjoy cruelty most when it wears the mask of concern. Elena kept her chin level. "If you'll excuse me. Miss Vane is waiting." She did not wait to hear the laughter that followed her, though she heard it anyway. The way you hear your own heartbeat in a silent room. She had endured worse. She would endure this. She carried the lemonade back across the ballroom floor, weaving between silk skirts and polished boots, her eyes fixed on the golden shape of Seraphina near the terrace doors. She did not see Seraphina's eyes narrow as she approached. She did not see the small, deliberate step Seraphina took backward, directly into her path, at precisely the moment Elena's foot came down. What she felt was the floor tilting. The glass of lemonade left her hand and shattered somewhere far away. Her own foot caught in the hem of her gown, a hem that had, she would realize only later, been stepped on and held, just for a moment, just long enough, beneath the pointed toe of Seraphina's ice-blue slipper, and the old, carefully mended seam at her waist gave way with a sound like tearing paper, and Elena Marsh went down hard on the ballroom floor in front of 200 of the finest families in the county. Her mother's gown split open at the side from hip to knee. The patched, mended, humiliating truth of her poverty laid bare under the candlelight for everyone to see. For one full second, the ballroom was silent. Then it was not. The laughter started at the edges, the way fire starts at the edges, small and uncertain. And then it caught, and it spread, and within moments, Half the room was laughing behind gloved hands and fans, and Eleanor knelt on the polished floor in the wreckage of her only good gown, in a puddle of spilled lemonade, and felt every year of careful, controlled invisibility burn away in an instant. "Oh, how clumsy," Seraphina said, loudly enough to carry. Her hand pressed to her mouth in an expression of theatrical dismay that did not reach her eyes. "Elena." "Dear!" "Are you hurt? You must be more careful." Elena looked up. She looked up, and she saw, with perfect clarity, the small, satisfied curve at the corner of Seraphina's mouth. There and gone in an instant, visible to no one who was not looking directly for it. She was looking directly for it. "You stepped on my hem," Elena said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The laughter around them had already begun to falter, uncertain now, sensing that something had shifted. "I beg your pardon. You stepped on my hem, and you held it there, and you pushed me." Elena did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She knelt on the floor of the finest ballroom in the county, with her torn gown gathered around her, and she said it plainly. "The way you state a fact about the weather. You did it on purpose." "How dare you!" Seraphina's composure cracked at the edges, a flush of real anger rising beneath the practiced dismay. "You ungrateful," hysterical. "That is enough." The voice cut through the ballroom like a blade through silk, low and absolutely final, and every head turned toward the Duke of Wrenmoor, who had crossed the floor without anyone quite noticing him move, and now stood directly beside Eleanor, looking down at her with an expression that made the nearest onlookers take an involuntary step back. He did not offer platitudes. He did not ask if she was hurt in the vague, useless way that people ask when they do not actually wish to know the answer. He removed his own coat, a duke, in front of 200 witnesses, and crouched, and settled it around Elena's shoulders, covering the torn gown, covering the mended seams and the poverty they revealed, with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had made a decision and did not intend to explain it to anyone. "Can you stand?" he asked her, quietly, and it was the first time all evening anyone had spoken to her as though her answer mattered. "Yes," Elena said, though her hands, hidden in the folds of his coat, were shaking. He helped her to her feet. He did not hurry. He did not seem to notice, or care, that the entire ballroom had gone utterly silent, watching a duke kneel on a ballroom floor for his fiancée's poor relation. "Your Grace," Seraphina's voice had gone thin and high, "you mustn't trouble yourself. She is only the companion." Gideon turned to look at her. It was not an angry look. It was worse than angry. It was the look of a man recalculating, in real time, a decision he had made about her entire character. "I saw what you did, Miss Vane," he said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, though word of it would travel through the ballroom within the hour regardless, growing with every retelling. "I would think very carefully about what you say next." He did not wait for her reply. He offered Eleanor his arm, his bare arm, his coat still around her shoulders, and walked her from the ballroom floor, through the parting crowd, past her aunt's white, furious face, and out through the great doors into the cool night air, leaving 200 of the finest families in the county to fill the silence he left behind with a scandal that would not be finished burning for months. Behind them, the ballroom did not return to its music for some time. Lady Pelham, 70 years old and famously immune to spectacle, was heard to remark to her companion that she had not seen anything so satisfying at a ball since the Duke of Cardingham had been caught in the conservatory with his own gamekeeper's daughter, and that at least this scandal had the virtue of a decent man behaving decently in the middle of it. Not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Several mothers with unmarried daughters exchanged glances, heavy with recalculation, already wondering what a duke's evident weakness for penniless companions might mean for their own carefully laid plans. And in the corner nearest the terrace, Seraphina Vane stood very still amid the wreckage of her triumphant evening, her ice-blue silk suddenly looking less like a crown and more like a costume whose performance had gone badly. Publicly wrong. Smile, her mother hissed under her breath, gripping her daughter's arm hard enough to bruise. Everyone is watching. Smile, and dance, and give them nothing else to talk about tonight. Seraphina smiled. It did not reach her eyes, and everyone who looked closely enough could see it. And a great many people looked closely enough, because there is no entertainment in society quite so satisfying as watching a beautiful, cruel young woman discover that the world does not, in fact, arrange itself entirely around her comfort. The carriage ride home was silent and endless. Aunt Priscilla did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence had a texture Elena knew intimately, the deep, controlled fury that would find its voice later, in private, where witnesses could not soften its edges. It found its voice within the hour. "You have ruined us," her aunt said, the moment the drawing-room door closed behind them. "Do you understand what you have done? The Duke of Wrenmoor knelt on a ballroom floor for you, in front of the Ashcombs, the Pelhams, half of London society, and you let him do it. I did not ask him to. That is not the point." Priscilla's hand came down hard on the mantelpiece. "The point is that my daughter's engagement, the single greatest achievement of this family in a generation, now hangs by a thread because you could not manage to walk across a ballroom without making a spectacle. She tripped me. She did no such thing. And if you repeat that lie in front of anyone else, I will turn you out of this house without a character reference, and you may see how well your pride serves you on the street." Priscilla's eyes were bright with something that might have been fear beneath the anger, fear of what her daughter's fury would cost them all if the engagement truly collapsed. "You will apologize to Seraphina in the morning. You will tell her, and anyone who asks, that you tripped over your own hem like the clumsy, careless girl you are. Do you understand me?" Elena stood very still, Gideon's coat still, absurdly. Around her shoulders she had forgotten to return it, and no one had thought to ask for it back. "I understand what you are asking of me." "Then do it." "I did not say I would." The slap came fast and hard, and Elena's head snapped sideways, and for a moment the room rang with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Priscilla stood, breathing hard, her hand still raised, as though she could not quite believe what she had done, or perhaps could not quite believe it had taken this long. "Go to your room," she said finally, her voice flat now, all fire spent. "We will discuss your future in the morning." Elena went. She climbed the narrow back stairs to the small room under the eaves that had been hers for 5 years, and she sat on the edge of the thin mattress, and she did not cry, because crying had never once solved anything in this house, and instead she sat very still with the Duke's coat wrapped around her shoulders, breathing in the faint smell of cedar and rain that clung to the fabric, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not particularly care anymore what happened to this family's reputation. She did not apologize in the morning. She had every intention of leaving quietly instead of packing the small canvas bag she had kept ready for 5 years, precisely for a day like this one, and walking to the village to find whatever work a disgraced companion could find when the knock came at the front door at 9:30. Far too early for social calls, and the housemaid's flustered voice carried up the stairs. His Grace, the Duke of Wrenmoor, to see Miss Marsh. Eleanor stood frozen at the top of the stairs, the coat still folded over her arm, ready to be returned and forgotten. Below, she could hear her aunt's voice, pitched high with false delight, ushering the Duke into the good parlour, already recalculating, already imagining a version of events in which nothing irreparable had occurred at all. "Your Grace, what an honour! Please, do sit. May I offer?" "I have come to speak with Miss Marsh," Gideon said, and there was no warmth in it, only the same flat, immovable authority Elena remembered from the ballroom. "Alone, if you would permit it." Priscilla's hesitation lasted exactly as long as it took her to remember who she was speaking to. "Of course, Your Grace." "Eleanor, come down at once." Elena came down. She stood in the doorway of the good parlour, still holding his coat, acutely aware of the faint red mark on her cheek that no amount of powder had fully concealed. And Gideon's gaze found it immediately and did not move for a long moment. "Your aunt struck you," he said. "It was not a question. That is not your concern. Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "It is not, and yet—" He did not explain further. He crossed the room and took the coat from her arms, folding it once over his own, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the faint, white line of an old scar disappearing beneath his collar. "I have broken my engagement to Miss Vane," he said. Elena's breath caught. Behind her, she heard her aunt's sharp intake of air from the hallway, where she had clearly not gone far enough to be out of earshot. "You needn't have done that on my account. I did not do it on your account." His grey eyes held hers, steady and entirely without artifice. "I did it because I spent 3 days having my solicitors examine the Vane family's finances after last night, and I discovered that Lord Vane's estate is mortgaged to the ceiling. His daughter's dowry does not exist, and the entire engagement was built on a fraud designed to secure my fortune before I discovered the truth. What happened to you at the ball was simply the moment I stopped being willing to overlook what kind of family I was marrying into." "I see. I do not think you do." "Entirely." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I have spent a year since inheriting this title being managed. Miss Marsh, presented with lists of acceptable brides, told what alliances would serve the estate, informed of my own preferences by people who had never troubled to ask me what they were. Last night, in a room full of 200 people who were told exactly how to think and precisely what to overlook, you were the only person who told the truth out loud, at cost to yourself, when it would have been far easier not to." Elena said nothing. She did not trust her own voice. "I am not a romantic man," Gideon continued, quietly. "I do not believe in love matches, or fate, or any of the nonsense written into novels. But I find I have no further interest in marrying a woman who would step on another woman's hem to save herself an inconvenient comparison. I find, instead, that I am interested in the woman who told 200 people the truth while kneeling on a ballroom floor. Your Grace, I am asking you to marry me." "Miss Marsh," he said it plainly, without ceremony, the way he seemed to say everything, not out of pity, not out of guilt over a torn gown. I am asking because I have met a great many women this season who were taught to be admired, and precisely one who was never taught to disappear, no matter how hard everyone around her tried to teach her otherwise. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the hallway, Elena could hear her aunt's ragged, disbelieving breathing. "You do not know me," Elena said finally. "No," Gideon agreed. "But I intend to. I find I would rather learn slowly and honestly than continue with what I already knew perfectly, and hated." He held out his hand, not to take hers, simply an offer, left open. "The choice is entirely yours. I have arranged nothing with your aunt. I will arrange nothing without your answer first." Elena looked at his open hand. She thought of 5 years of careful invisibility, of mended hems and lowered eyes, and a life measured out in exactly how little space she was permitted to occupy. She thought of the look on Seraphina's face in the instant before she stepped backward onto her hem small, satisfied, certain of her own untouchable position in the world, and she thought of how thoroughly, how completely, that certainty was about to be dismantled. "Yes," she said. The engagement, when it was announced 3 days later, detonated through London society like a cannon shot. The Duke of Wrenmoor, jilting the celebrated beauty, Miss Seraphina Vane, to marry her own penniless companion, it was, by any measure, the scandal of the decade, and it travelled through drawing-rooms and gentlemen's clubs with a speed that left the Vane family no time whatsoever to construct a counter-narrative before the truth of their finances began leaking out alongside it. In the days between the announcement and Gideon's visit to the Vane townhouse, Seraphina had not been idle. She understood, with the particular sharp instinct of someone who had built her entire life on the management of appearances, that her only remaining weapon was speed. If she could reach the right drawing-rooms before the Duke's version of events settled into common knowledge, she might yet salvage something. "It is quite simple," she told her mother, pacing the length of the good parlour while her mother wrung a handkerchief into ruin. "We say the girl threw herself at his feet deliberately. We say she tore her own hem for sympathy, knowing he was watching, knowing exactly the kind of man who could not resist playing the hero. It is far more believable than the truth, and considerably more flattering to everyone except her, Seraphina. Half the ballroom saw. Half the ballroom saw a girl fall down and a duke pick her up. What they did not see was my foot, my mother, because no one was looking at my foot. I intend that no one ever does." She stopped pacing and fixed her mother with the bright, brittle certainty that had carried her through 21 years of getting precisely what she wanted. "We call on Lady Pelham this afternoon. If we can win her, we win the rest within a week." Lady Pelham received them with the icy, delighted courtesy of a woman who had already made up her mind and intended to enjoy watching Seraphina fail to change it. She listened to the entire rehearsed account of a clumsy, attention-seeking companion with an expression of polite, unmoved interest. And when Seraphina finished, she took a slow sip of her tea before answering. "How curious," Lady Pelham said, "that I was standing not 4 feet away, Miss Vane, and saw your slipper quite distinctly beneath her hem before either of you moved. I am old, my dear, not blind." She set down her cup with a small, final click of china against saucer. "I think you had better go home and consider very carefully what you intend to say to people who are not. In fact, looking in another direction entirely." Seraphina left the Pelham townhouse with her composure intact and her prospects, though she did not yet fully grasp it, already in ruins. The story that spread through London that week was not the one she had rehearsed. It was Lady Pelham's, told and retold with relish at every dinner table that would have her. And by the time Gideon arrived at the Vane townhouse to deliver the news of his solicitor's findings, the family's reputation had already begun the slow collapse that his revelations about their finances would only complete. Lord Vane received the Duke in his study 4 days after the ball, summoned rather than invited, and Gideon did not sit. "You cannot do this," Lord Vane said, his face the colour of old plaster. "The contracts are signed. The settlements are void," Gideon said. Clause 14. "Any material misrepresentation of assets voids the agreement in full. Your estate is mortgaged for £11,000 beyond what you disclose to my solicitors. I have the documents. I have copies lodged with 3 separate parties. Should you consider disputing this in court, you would ruin my family over a companion's torn dress. I would ruin your family over your daughter's cruelty and your own dishonesty. Lord Vane." The dress was simply the moment I stopped being willing to pretend I hadn't noticed either. Gideon's voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made it more devastating than shouting could have. "Word of your finances will reach your creditors by the end of the week, regardless of anything I do or do not say further. I would suggest you spend your remaining time settling your affairs rather than attempting to intimidate me into silence." Serafina, who had been listening from the doorway, could contain herself no longer. "You would throw away everything for her. She is nothing. She has nothing. In a year you will remember exactly what a mistake this was." Gideon turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her take an involuntary step backward. "In a year," he said quietly, "I expect I will remember precisely how you looked the moment you decided to humiliate a woman with less power than you. Purely because you could. I do not think that memory will improve with time. Miss Vane, I would advise you to consider, very seriously, why it does not trouble you more than it appears to." He left without waiting for a response, and behind him, the Vane household began the slow, humiliating collapse into the very scandal they had spent years pretending could never touch them. The wedding took place 11 days later, in a small stone chapel far from London's prying eyes, with only a handful of witnesses and no fanfare whatsoever. Eleanor wore a gown of deep green, chosen and paid for by Gideon himself, cut simply, without the elaborate lace and beading that had marked every gown she had ever coveted and never owned. She did not need elaborate. She had, for the first time in 5 years, an entire church full of people looking at her, without a single one of them looking down. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar said, and Gideon did. Briefly, formally, in front of witnesses, and then in the carriage afterward. Once the door had closed and the horses had begun to move, he kissed her again, properly this time, with none of the ceremony's restraint, and Eleanor understood, in the sudden warmth of it, that the plain, transactional arrangement he had offered her 11 days earlier had already, quietly, become something else entirely. "We leave for Wrenmoor tomorrow," he said afterward, his forehead resting against hers, his voice rough. "It is a 4-day journey. The estate is remote Northumberland, near the border. I will understand if the prospect does not appeal to you. Anything is an improvement on my aunt's attic," Elena said, and he laughed a short, startled sound. as though laughing itself required practice, he had let lapse. I do not doubt it. Though they dined together that evening at a small inn along the London road, the last night before the long journey north properly began, and for the first time since the ballroom. There was no audience, no ceremony, nothing left to perform for anyone's benefit. "May I ask you something?" Elena said. Over a plate of indifferent mutton, neither of them had much appetite for. "And may I ask that you answer honestly, rather than kindly? I generally find those two things are not mutually exclusive. But you may ask, why did you truly stop looking for a wife among women who were taught to be admired? You could have chosen anyone. A duchess with connections, a fortune, a name that would have opened every door in London twice over. Instead, you chose a woman with nothing but a torn gown and an aunt who struck her for embarrassing the family." Gideon set down his fork and considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "My brother died believing that duty and happiness were entirely separate pursuits, to be managed in separate rooms of one's life. He married well, by every measure society values, and I do not believe he was happy a single day of it. I watched that marriage for 8 years before the title came to me, and I promised myself, when it did, that I would rather be thought a fool by every drawing-room in London than repeat it." He looked at her directly. "You did not flatter me at the ball. You did not flatter your aunt, or Miss Vane, or anyone in that room, at considerable cost to yourself. I have had a great many people flatter me since I inherited this title. Elena, I find I trust the ones who don't. Rather more. That is a very unromantic answer. I did warn you I was not a romantic man." "You did." She studied him for a long moment across the candlelight. "I find I do not entirely mind it. I have had a great deal of romantic language directed at me in my life. Your Grace, mostly from relations attempting to convince me that gratitude was owed for very small kindnesses. I think I prefer the truth, however unromantic, to any amount of pretty phrasing built on a lie." Something shifted in his expression, then not quite a smile, but close to it, the particular warmth of a man realizing, gradually, that the bargain he had struck out of principle might yet become something considerably warmer than principle alone. The journey north began well enough, good roads, mild weather, long silent hours in the carriage that Elena found, to her own surprise, comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the particular ease of two people who had already decided they did not need to perform conversation for each other's benefit. Gideon read through estate ledgers. Elena watched the countryside change, the neat hedgerows of the south giving way to broader, wilder land, stone walls instead of fences, sheep instead of cattle. On the third day, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to rise. "Storm," Gideon said, glancing out the window with the flat assessment of a man who had spent enough time outdoors to read weather like a ledger of its own. "We should reach the coaching inn before it breaks. If we push on," they did not reach it in time. The storm came down off the fells with a suddenness that caught even the coachman by surprise, rain turning to sleet within the span of a quarter-hour. The narrow moorland road dissolving into churned mud beneath the wheels. The carriage lurched, and lurched again, and on the third violent tilt, the rear wheel dropped into a rut hidden beneath standing water, and the whole vehicle canted sideways with a crack of splintering wood that Elena felt in her teeth. "Stay inside," Gideon ordered. "Already moving. already forcing the door open against the wind. She did not stay inside. She climbed out into the driving sleet, perhaps 20 seconds behind him. Her cloak instantly soaked through, and found him wrestling with the lead horse, which had reared in its traces and was threatening to drag the entire rig further into the ditch. The coachman, a young man, not much older than herself, was shouting uselessly at the animal's head, accomplishing nothing. Elena had grown up, before her father's debts, in a house with stables and dogs, and no particular concern for what a young lady ought or ought not to be able to do with her hands. She waded through the mud to the second horse, the one feeding its own panic into the leader's, and seized its harness near the collar with both hands. "Stand," she said, in a voice that had nothing genteel left in it at all. "Stand still, you great fool." The horse, startled by the sudden sharpness of command, stilled. With the panic no longer spreading down the line, Gideon managed to force the leader's head down and steady it, and within minutes the immediate danger had passed, though the carriage itself remained hopelessly mired. One wheel cracked beyond any repair the roadside could offer. They stood in the rain afterward, all three of them soaked through and shaking, and Gideon looked at Elena, at her ruined cloak, her mud-streaked face, the reckless competence she had shown without a moment's hesitation, with an expression she had not seen on him before. "You were not meant to do that," he said. "You were not meant to try managing 2 panicked horses alone in a storm," Elena said. "I do not see that either of us has much room for complaint." He laughed again, twice now. In as many days, more than she suspected, he had laughed in the year since his brother's death had handed him a title he had never wanted, and something in his face, in that unguarded moment of laughter in the freezing rain, made Elena's chest ache in a way she did not yet have a name for. They spent the night in a shepherd's stone cottage a mile further up the road, the coachman having ridden one of the horses ahead for help. And there was exactly 1 bed, and exactly 1 fire, and Gideon insisted, with a formality that made Elena want to laugh despite the cold, on sleeping in the single hard chair by the hearth rather than share the narrow bed. "You will freeze," she told him. "I have slept in considerably worse conditions than this, Your Grace." It was the first time he had called her that, and something about it, delivered dryly, in the dark, made her smile in a way she could not entirely explain. "I am aware you were a soldier," she said. "I am not aware you were made of stone." Elena, her name, unadorned. In the firelight, it was the first time he had used it. "I made you a bargain in your aunt's parlour. Marriage, and time to learn one another, honestly. I do not intend to abandon the second half of that bargain simply because a storm has thrown us together sooner than either of us planned." "I am not asking you to abandon anything," Elena said quietly. "I am asking you not to freeze on a stone floor out of a sense of honor neither of us requires tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, firelight moving across the scar above his eyebrow, and then he crossed the small room and sat, not in the bed, but on the floor beside it, his back against the frame, close enough that she could rest her hand against his shoulder if she chose, which, eventually, in the small hours of the night, she did. Neither of them mentioned it in the morning. Both of them, Elena suspected, remembered it perfectly. Wrenmoor Hall, when they finally reached it 2 days later, was exactly as forbidding as its name suggested. A great grey stone house crouched against the moor, half its windows dark, its gardens overgrown from years of a distant, disinterested master. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, met them on the front steps with the particular stiff correctness of a woman who had already decided, before meeting her, precisely what to think of a duke's hastily acquired bride. "Your Grace." Her curtsy to Gideon was correct. Her glance at Elena, mud-streaked travelling clothes. No lady's maid, no trunks of fine gowns was assessing. And not kindly. "Mrs. Price, my wife, the Duchess of Wrenmoor." "Your Grace." The second curtsy came a beat slower than the first. Elena met her eyes directly, without flinching, without the reflexive apology for her own appearance that 5 years of training urged her toward. "We will want hot water, Mrs. Price. A great deal of it, and whatever can be prepared quickly. We have been on the road for 6 days." Something in Mrs. Price's expression flickered, not quite approval, but the first faint crack in her certainty. "Of course. Your Grace, I'll have the rooms prepared at once. Separate rooms. For tonight," Elena added, before the housekeeper could assume otherwise, and felt Gideon's brief, startled glance beside her, and did not look at him, and did not entirely regret it either. The first weeks at Wrenmoor were a quiet campaign of proving herself, fought not with words but with ledgers. Elena had spent 5 years managing a household on nothing, stretching every farthing her aunt grudgingly allotted her, and she brought that same relentless, unglamorous competence to an estate that had been neglected for a year in the chaos following the previous duke's death. She found tenant farms with roofs left unrepaired. She found accounts that had not been properly reconciled in months. She did not shout about any of it. She simply sat at the study desk each morning, sleeves pushed back, and began, methodically, to fix it. The steward, a heavy-set man named Harlow, who had clearly grown comfortable managing an estate no one troubled to oversee, did not take well to a duchess questioning his ledgers. With respect, "Your Grace," he said, on her 4th morning at Wrenmoor, in a tone that suggested very little respect at all. "Estate business has always been handled between the steward and his Grace directly. It is not customary for the lady of the house to trouble herself with figures." "I am certain that is true," Elena said pleasantly, not looking up from the page in front of her. "It is also not customary for a tenant farm to report 3 consecutive years of failed harvest, while the steward's own cottage acquires a new roof, new stabling, and, I notice here, a rather expensive matched pair of carriage horses. Perhaps you would care to explain the arithmetic, Mr. Harlow, before I ask His Grace to review it with you himself." Harlow's face went through several colours in rapid succession. The tenant in question, the Mould Farm. The man is lazy, Your Grace, and prone to drink. His failures are his own doing. Then you will not object to my speaking with him directly. Elena finally looked up. "I intend to ride out to the Mould Farm this afternoon. You are welcome to accompany me, Mr. Harlow, and explain your assessment of the man to his face. Or you may remain here and reconsider whether there is anything in these accounts you would prefer to amend before I return." She rode out that afternoon, regardless, and found not a lazy drunkard, but an exhausted widower named Silas Mould, attempting, alone, to manage 60 acres with a roof that had been collapsing since before the old Duke's death. His requests for repair materials submitted 3 times to the steward's office, and ignored 3 times in turn. Elena sat in his kitchen, drank his wife's sister's thin, overbrewed tea, and listened for an hour to an account of neglect that made her understanding of Harlow's expensive new carriage horses considerably less charitable by the time she returned to Wrenmoor Hall that evening. Mud to her knees and entirely unrepentant about it, she had already decided what needed to happen. Harlow was dismissed within the week. His replacement, a sharp, capable young man from the village, whom Elena had noticed asking exactly the right questions at the tenant meeting she had, without asking anyone's permission, called into being. The mould farm had its roof by the first hard frost. You cannot simply dismiss my steward without consulting me, Gideon said that evening, though there was no real heat in it, only the faint, bemused note of a man watching his household reorganize itself with startling efficiency around him. "I did consult you," Elena said. "I am consulting you now." He was stealing from tenants who had no one else to speak for them, and I did not think it required a formal debate to conclude that ought to stop. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something between exasperation and open admiration crossing his face. "Remind me," he said finally, "never to give you cause to review my own conduct quite so thoroughly. I already have." "Your Grace," Elena said, "you have simply not yet given me anything to find." Gideon watched this happen with the quiet fascination of a man observing a process he did not fully understand, but recognized immediately as valuable. He found her in the tenant offices, dismantling a steward's excuses with cold, patient logic. He found her in the kitchens at dawn, discussing grain stores with the cook as though she had done it her entire life, which, in truth, she nearly had. "You are not what I expected," he told her one evening, some 3 weeks in, finding her at the study desk long after the household had gone to bed, a single candle burning low beside a stack of ledgers. "What did you expect?" "I am not certain. Someone who would need protecting. Perhaps someone the storm would have frightened, rather than someone who waded into it to hold a horse's harness." He sat in the chair opposite, unbidden, and for a while they simply worked in companionable silence, the fire cracking softly in the grate, until he spoke again, quietly. "I did not marry you out of pity. Elena, I want you to know that I have thought about it a great deal since the ballroom, and I find the truth is rather less noble than I first presented it. I married you because when I saw you kneeling on that floor, telling the truth to a room that did not want to hear it, I recognized something in you I had spent a year of grieving and duty-trying and failing to find in myself." Elena set down her pen. "And have you found it since?" "I am finding it," Gideon said, slowly, in the presence of a woman who apparently cannot pass a panicking horse without intervening. She laughed, and he reached across the desk and took her hand, not with the formal, ceremonial gentleness of their wedding kiss, but with something raw, more uncertain, and when she did not pull away, he stood and drew her up with him, and kissed her the way he had in the carriage on their wedding day thoroughly, without restraint, as though the plain bargain struck in a London parlour had finally, entirely, become something neither of them had bargained for at all. "Stay," he said against her hair, afterward, his voice low and rough. "Tonight, not out of duty. I am asking you, Elena, not instructing you." "I know the difference now," she said. "I did not always. You are the one who taught me that difference mattered." He kissed her again in answer, and this time, when they climbed the stairs together, they did not stop at separate doors. The Dowager Duchess arrived without warning in the second week of November. her carriage announced only by the sound of gravel under wheels, and Mrs. Price's sudden, alarmed flurry through the hallway. "Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess of Wrenmoor," the housekeeper announced, in a tone that suggested this was a visitation on the scale of a minor natural disaster. And Eleanor, caught in a plain wool morning dress with ink on her fingers from the estate ledgers, had exactly the time it took to cross the hall to prepare herself for the arrival of her husband's formidable mother. The dowager was small, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular ramrod posture of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own opinion. She looked Elena over from the doorway of the drawing-room with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. And Eleanor, who had spent 5 years being assessed by people who had already decided what they thought of her, met that gaze without flinching, ink-stained fingers and all. "So," the dowager said, before Gideon could complete even the first syllable of an introduction, "you are the companion. I am the Duchess of Wrenmoor, Your Grace," Elena said, "though I was, until recently, a companion." "Yes." The dowager's eyebrow rose a fraction. "I have heard 3 entirely different accounts of what happened at that ballroom, none of which agree on a single particular, except that my son removed his own coat in front of half of London for a woman he had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with. I have come to hear the truth from the only person likely to give it to me plainly." "Then I will tell you plainly," Elena said. "Miss Vane stepped on my hem and held it there until it tore, in front of 200 witnesses, because my presence embarrassed her, and because she believed, correctly until that evening, that no one of any consequence would trouble themselves to notice or care. Your son noticed. I do not know why. You would have to ask him what he saw that made him decide to." Gideon, who had clearly expected to referee a far more delicate conversation, said nothing at all, watching the exchange with an expression Elena could not quite read. The dowager studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, made a short sound that might, in a woman less dignified, have been called a laugh. "Well, at least you do not simper. I have met a great many young women this season who would have wept and thanked me for the privilege of my visit before I had finished removing my gloves." She settled herself into the nearest chair without waiting to be invited, a woman entirely accustomed to commanding whatever room she occupied. "Sit, both of you. I did not travel 4 days over frozen roads to stand in a doorway being appraised." She stayed 3 days. She interrogated the household accounts, which Eleanor had reorganized so thoroughly that even the dowager, who had run this estate herself for 30 years before her husband's death, found little to criticize. She inspected the tenant cottages Eleanor had insisted be repaired before winter set in fully, and said nothing about them at all, which Gideon later explained was, from his mother, the very highest form of praise available. On the morning of her departure, she took Elena's hands in her own. Briefly, an uncharacteristic gesture that seemed to surprise them both. "My son spent a year after his brother's death being managed by everyone around him, myself included, I will admit, and growing colder for it with every passing month." The dowager said, "I do not entirely understand what happened in that ballroom, and I suspect the full truth of it is rather less tidy than the version currently circulating through London's drawing rooms. But I have watched him at dinner these 3 evenings, Duchess, and I have not seen my son look at anyone the way he looks at you since he was a boy, long before any of this weight fell onto his shoulders. Whatever you did, however you did, it do not stop. It was," Elena would reflect later, the closest thing to a blessing she had ever received from anyone in either family, by blood or by marriage, and she found she valued it rather more than she had expected to. Though December came down over the moor in a hard white silence, snow drifting waist-deep against the garden walls, the lock beyond the house frozen to black glass. Wrenmoor Hall, once dark and half abandoned, now blazed with fires in every hearth, and the sound of Elena's voice instructing, laughing, arguing pleasantly with Mrs. Price over the winter accounts had become as much a part of the house as its old grey stones. The post arrived rarely in winter, forced through the drifts only when absolutely necessary. And so, the letter that arrived on a bright, bitterly cold Tuesday carried a particular weight, simply by having made the journey at all. It bore a London seal Elena did not immediately recognize. She read it in the drawing-room, seated on the rug before the fire, Gideon in the armchair behind her, his hand resting idly on her shoulder as he read his own correspondence. She felt him go still as her breath caught. "What is it?" "News from London." Elena's eyes moved down the page. "An old acquaintance's looping, gossip-hungry hand. Lord Vane's estate has been seized by his creditors. He has fled to the continent to avoid debtor's prison." Seraphina, she paused, reading it again to be certain she had understood correctly. "Seraphina has married Baron Hemlock." "The one with the gout," Gideon said. "And the 3 chins. And the damp manor in Sussex he never leaves." "The very same." Elena set the letter down slowly in her lap. They say she wept through the entire ceremony. She waited to feel something triumph, satisfaction, the sharp, hot pleasure of revenge finally delivered. Instead, what came was quieter and colder and stranger than she had expected. "Do you feel sorry for her?" Gideon asked, watching her face. "No." Elena looked at the fire rather than the letter. "I do not feel anything for her at all, and I think that frightens me more than hatred would have. She spent an entire evening planning exactly how to hurt me, in front of 200 witnesses, purely because my presence was an inconvenient reminder of something she did not wish to see in herself. And now her whole world has collapsed, and I find I have nothing left to give her. Not anger, not pity, nothing. That is not coldness," Gideon said quietly. "That is simply the absence of a wound that healed." Eleanor folded the letter and, after a moment's consideration, leaned forward and fed it to the flames. The paper caught quickly, curling black at the edges, the London seal melting into a dark smear before the whole of it dissolved to ash and rose, briefly, up the chimney. "Good," Gideon said, echoing something he had told her once before, in a different room, in what felt now like a different life. "I do not want ghosts in this house." "Neither do I," Elena said, and meant it entirely, for the first time. That afternoon, once the snow had briefly stopped and the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue, they walked together down to the frozen edge of the loch, gloved hands linked, boots crunching through drifts that came nearly to Elena's knees. There were no ballrooms here, no torn hems, no watching crowds, no careful calculations of exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. There was only the vast white silence of the moor, and the man beside her, who had knelt on a ballroom floor in front of 200 people simply because it was the right thing to do, and had never once, since, made her feel that kindness had been a debt she owed him in return. She had been pushed to the floor and laughed at by a room full of people who had decided, long before that night, exactly how little she was worth. She had risen from that floor in another man's coat, and she had not stopped rising since. Society loves to watch a woman fall. It has far less appetite for watching her stand back up, unbroken, and build an entire kingdom out of the wreckage they left behind. Elena Marsh had been taught, for 5 long years, to take up as little space in the world as possible. Standing on the frozen shore of a Northumberland loch, her husband's hand warm around hers, she found she had absolutely no intention of shrinking again. If you have ever been made to feel small in a room that should have made space for you, I hope you remember this story. The mended seam does not make you less. The torn hem is not the end of you. Sometimes it is only the moment, in front of everyone who ever doubted you. When you finally rise, if Elena and Gideon's journey moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps this channel keep bringing you these stories. Share this video with someone who has ever been underestimated and proved everyone wrong. And if you enjoyed this deep, emotional historical romance, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Let me know in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest. I read everyone, and I will see you in the next story.